Okay. It looks like folks will still be joining us for a few minutes, but that is fine. We know it's getting near the holidays, and we appreciate folks being with us for this, what we think is an important and will be very interesting conversation. So, welcome to our webinar on avoiding pitfalls using science in the law, which we're subtitling Part One because we think this conversation will be continuing. It's a webinar that's a part of a series of webinars that the GW Animal Law and Science Project is conducting, trying to address conversations at the intersection of animal law and science. And so Dr. Lori Marino and myself organized that. And recordings for this webinar, as well as past webinars, are on the GW Animal Law YouTube, and I'll put that into the chat shortly. And we'll have some more information about our spring programming, so you can keep your eyes open for that. But our focus today is on this webinar with wonderful speakers who will be addressing the issues that arise at the intersection of animal law and truly often any law and science. And they'll highlight some of the mistakes people make at working in that intersection and offer some best practices. So presenting today and leading us in conversation are two wonderful speakers, Dr. Lori Marino, who's the founder and president of the Whale Sanctuary Project, and founder and executive director of the Camella Center, and adjunct professor at NYU. And Professor Delcy Winders, who is director of the Animal Law and Policy Institute and associate professor of law at the Vermont Law and Graduate School. So I'm very much looking forward to this important discussion. After Delcy and Lori speak, we'll open the floor to Q&A and have some conversation, but feel free, even while they're talking, to put your questions in the Q&A at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So that's it for me, and I'll turn it over to our wonderful speakers. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kathy. And I'm going to kick us off. But first, just really thank you to the Animal Law and Science Project at GW and Kathy and Lori for all of the important work they're doing on the intersection of animal law and science. So in the animal law space and the animal protection policy space, we talk a lot and think a lot about threshold procedural issues, like what cause of action can I come up with to get in the courtroom door? And then how do I avoid getting kicked out on standing? Or how do I get someone willing to introduce a bill and to get a hearing on that bill? And all of that, of course, is really, really important and critical. But we also need to be thinking about the actual substantive merits of our cases, whether that's a case in court or in front of a federal, state, or local lawmaking body, or a regulatory agency, which may well eventually end up in court. And science is so, so central to those merits in virtually any animal law matter. And that could be, demonstrating animal sentience or autonomy, showing that animals are in fact suffering in a particular situation in violation of the law, showing that a particular animal belongs to a protected species. And we could go on and on. And it seems like every day almost there's a new scientific study out teaching us something new about non-human animals and signaling their entitlement to moral consideration while the law continues to lag really far behind. And our job as advocates is to help the law catch up with our evolving and advancing scientific knowledge and societal values. But most of us at least, are not trained in the intersection of science on the one hand and law and policy on the other. We tend to be trained either as a scientist or as a lawyer or public policy expert. There are some exceptions for sure, and those people are really, really valuable. But bridging that gap without having to get, multiple advanced degrees is something that the Animal Law and Science Project at GW has been doing really great work on, has had some great webinars about. It's also something that Dr. Marino and I have been talking about and trying to address. And we started talking about this several years ago, and last year launched a novel science and animal law policy course, which we've now taught 3 times. And what we're going to talk about today is a little bit of what we cover in that class about using science as effectively as possible in your animal law and policy advocacy. So To lay the tape, to set the table, to lay the groundwork, Dr. Marino is going to give us an overview of the current scientific landscape. And then I'm going to talk very briefly about the current political landscape as it relates to science. And then we'll get into what you really came here today to hear about, which is common pitfalls to look out for when you are marrying animal law and policy advocacy and science. And then, most importantly, best practices to hopefully avoid those pitfalls. And then we'll open up for your questions. So I'll pass it to Dr. Marino now. Thanks.
Thank you, Delcy. And so thank you, Delcy, because this is such a pleasure. As you said, I believe the course we teach at Vermont is the only course ever that actually combines science and animal law in a formal way, in a pedagogical way, in a way for animal attorneys, students to use. So I'm really honored to be working on that with you. And of course, with Kathy as well in the Animal Law and Science Project. Um, I wanted to I'm the scientist part of this, right? So what I wanted to do was talk to you just very briefly about the current scientific landscape. Um, because right now, we are going through a peer review crisis. People have this notion that science is like somewhere up there on a pedestal. It's totally objective. It's totally, bias free. Scientists just walk around gathering data and they don't care what it says, and they're completely, free of any desires or any kind. Um, and science has always been held up as that. And at its best, it is. The scientific method is the best method we have for interrogating the world. And it's based, but the peer review process, the process of writing a paper, submitting it to a journal, and having it accepted for publication is based on a very important assumption. And that assumption is that it is an objective, fair review by peers. Okay? That when you get a paper, you evaluate it on its merits. It doesn't matter who wrote it. There's no agenda. It's just what is the quality, and is the quality enough to warrant publication? Unfortunately, the peer review process is also a battleground where conflicting factions try to bring the other down. And that doesn't sound very scientific, but it is the culture that we're in. This has always been a problem. For instance, back in the days when the tobacco industry was really trying to convince people that it wasn't so bad to smoke, that they're trying to manufacture a debate where, in fact, there was no controversy about the effects of smoking and tobacco and nicotine. All of these tactics were used, and they were used in a way that wasn't always adhering to a fair, peer-reviewed, scientific, objective process. Well, we see the same thing now, depending upon where, what you're working in. It could be some industry that you're working against, the factory farming industry, the captivity industry, the fur industry, you name it. But people now use the peer review process as more than just a place to get a fair review. Currently, academic publishing is dominated by profit-oriented companies for whom scientific knowledge is commodity, and it's to be sold to the academic community. And that's unfortunate, because when it becomes a commodity, then a lot of the pureness of what it's supposed to be goes out the window. Um, so the peer review crisis refers to the growing challenges in the academic publishing process. systematic biases, loopholes for usurping the integrity of the process. And I'm just going to talk about a couple of these. If you are a scientist or an attorney, you just go into any database. There are academic journals just everywhere, coming out of the walls. There's thousands and thousands and thousands. How do you navigate through that jungle? Which ones are the ones that are really reputable? Which are the ones that bend the rules a little bit? And how can you tell? There's two problems going on right now. Pay to play or special issues. Recently, many journals have decided that they're going to have special issues. And there's nothing wrong with that. There's the fundamentally, but some journals, what they do is they bundle relevant papers around a topic. But what happens is that sometimes if that special issue is sponsored by a particular organization or an industry, it's used to give a free pass to those who agree with that industry and reject those outside of it. You'll see some special issues, say, I mean, I've come across a lot sponsored by the zoo and aquarium industry, for instance. And I've personally had experience with having reviews rejected because they only wanted to fill that issue with studies and papers that said that keeping animals in captivity was a wonderful thing. And if there was any difference of opinion, a paper would not get into a special issue sponsored by SeaWorld and, the ACA and all of these trade organizations. So that's a real problem. So, you should be careful when you go to a special issue that, it may not be unbiased. Finally, all of these things are found in what are known as predatory journals. And they're increasing. These are academic publications that exploit the open access model. Um, they charge exorbitant author fees, and they don't provide the editorial and publishing services that you'll find in a legitimate journal. And their characteristics are that, they aggressively solicit. So I never get a solicitation from Nature or Science saying, come write a paper for us, but I do every day get solicitations from journals I've never heard of before in Timbuktu or somewhere. And, I'll sneeze and they'll publish it. So it's, when they're doing that, that's a red flag that there's something wrong. Citing impact factors from unknown sources is another thing. Um, Exorbitant page charges. I mean, these are businesses. So yeah, they want you to write a paper for them and they want to publish it and they want to charge you thousands of dollars to do that. It's usually the peer review is quite weak, and so is the quality control. You'll often find that these papers are not grammar or spell checked when they're published. Um, Usually there's very vague contact information. So with a predatory journal, if you have a question or if something goes wrong, you're going to be on a journey to try to find an editor or anybody to talk to because it's vague. It's like it's coming out of the black hole. And there's also a lack of transparency about the whole publication process. So, these are just a few things. They're happening. They're getting worse. You need to know about them. And we need to find a way to fight back against this because once you violate the fundamental peer review process of publishing science, you've gone somewhere you don't want to go. So that's partly why Delcy and I teach this course. It's because we want to arm people with tools to sort of find a way through and navigate through all of these issues. So that's what I'll say. Thank you.
Thanks, Lori. Ah, the political landscape.
Yes, the political landscape.
So we're in a really challenging moment. That's a vast understatement. And there is an assault on science. And I think that can make us maybe want to turn away from using it in our advocacy. And certainly, as always, in advocacy, knowing your audience is probably the most important thing. And there may be certain audiences where the science isn't the most important thing. But science still does play a critical role, notwithstanding, specious executive orders that talk about the gold standard in science and suggest that any uncertainty or using a precautionary principle is fundamentally problematic. That's really alarming. But I think it's really important to remember that this moment is not going to last forever. I promise you it won't. I know it feels like it will, but it won't. And if you've been in animal advocacy for any amount of time, you know that this stuff takes a long time. I mean, a single lawsuit can take years. It could take more than a decade. It can take easily a decade of getting a bill reintroduced before you can get it passed. And so we need to be thinking about, the long term. And that means continuing to rely on the science. If we're, say, submitting a petition for rulemaking or submitting comments today, those things are probably going to be litigated after the current administration. And so we need to be building a record that puts us in a place where we can litigate that as strongly as possible. Similarly, just today, here's a great example. Today in the Federal Register, there is a proposal to change regulatory language pertaining to the Endangered Species Act. So the Endangered Species Act is very clear that when making listing determinations, you should only be considering the scientific evidence. And so we have a regulation that says you should only consider the scientific evidence, and therefore you should not consider economic factors. Now we have a proposed rule saying we're going to remove that language about economic factors. But the fact of the matter is that the law still stands. The law still says only scientific information should be considered. And it's one example of our statutes that embed science into them. And so the current administration can't just wipe that away as easily as it would like to. And so we have some things on our side in using the science, and that's why it's really still useful despite the climate of the moment to be laying a strong scientific foundation for our advocacy.
I would add to that, Delcy, that, one of the ways to mitigate some of these problems, I mean, first of all, yeah, science is science when it's done properly. It is, again, like I said, I think the best way that we have of interrogating the world. And one of the ways you can mitigate against the political landscape and all the other stuff is to really get your feet wet. In other words, don't rely upon third parties and others to tell you what's relevant. Get in there, go to the databases, go to Google search. You're interested in a particular topic. Don't just look for that topic, and pull it out and I got it. No, go before that, a little before that. Where did that come from? And then after that, the thing about science is you always have to be working. It changes all the time. And so, as Delcy said, if you're working on a case 5, 10 years, the science is going to change. And you need to know how it's changing. And that requires you to always be engaged and know what the latest is and what it says. So you can never be lazy with science. You always have to be on top of it. But that helps you to to use the best science available for your arguments.
Yeah, you just seamlessly moved us into our common pitfalls discussion. That was really beautiful. So yeah, we've already touched on the first one, relying on secondary sources. And the gold standard source is a peer-reviewed study. There are challenges within that arena, as we just heard about, but ultimately, you do want to be relying on peer-reviewed studies, not, for example, someone's description of a study, what they think the study said. And I see that way more often than I would like. Probably the worst thing you could do, but I see it happen, is to rely on a media report describing a study. So, I love reporters. They're also important in advocacy, but they're not trained as scientists. So even with the best intentions, their characterizations of a study can easily be inaccurate. Also, they can tend towards being more sensationalist. I mean, if you're a lawyer, you probably have experienced seeing a media story and being like, this is completely off about the legal issue that they're talking about. And that's why we have a media fellows program where reporters can come take an animal law class and get to know experts who they can consult with. But we also need that on the scientific side. But even if it's not just, you're going beyond a media story, I see people rely on advocacy organizations' summaries of a study or advocacy organizations' white papers, things like that. And I know a lot of these advocacy organizations are very rigorous when they're putting this stuff together, but it's still not a primary source. And it's going to undermine your credibility out of the gate if you're relying on that. It's going to make people think, oh, you're relying on biased sources. So that's a good starting place, but it should only be a starting place. And the ending place should be scientific study.
Exactly. And you can use, what's known as gray literature, there's nothing wrong with using it and including it in your citations, but it can't be used alone. You have to make sure that the points that you make come out of the peer-reviewed literature, if you can, because that's really, as Dulcie said, where the credibility is.
Yeah. Should we go to the next one? Inadequate research.
You want to share our slides?
Oh, I think they're shared. Can folks
Are they? Oh,
they
okay.
should be. Yeah, I think the common pitfalls one should be up, but
Okay. Okay.
somebody please put in the Q&A if I'm wrong about that.
Don't think they're showing Delcy.
Oh.
And I don't think they're shared yet.
Oh, I am so sorry, folks. I was like, I'm on top of this, but how about now?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay,
Great. Terrific.
good. Um, all right, so let's go on to the next one, inadequate research, which Lori already touched on a little bit. Um, The worst is just relying on a single study. Like you find a study, you're like, yes, this supports me. It says what I want. And then you're not looking at the other research. If you're a lawyer, if you find a good case, that's great, but you still need to know what the other cases say. You need to know if that case has been overturned or distinguished. You need to know what other jurisdictions have said. And so you cannot rely on a single study. You can't, do your research and then be done because science is constantly evolving. So you need to stay on top of the emerging scholarship. You have to look at the studies that the opposition might rely on, in the same way you need to look at the cases that your opposition is going to rely on so that you can be prepared in advance to rebut them. You, there are some AI tools that are helpful for research, some more than others, but you don't want to rely solely on those tools. So those are some examples of research being inadequate. Laura, you probably have some more to add there.
Well, I mean, because it's always changing with a lot of findings, especially in areas like animal cognition, animal sentience, animal welfare, there's so much that we don't know yet. So there's tons and tons of studies being done. And so at any given time, it's not going to be the final word or the whole word. And so you really need to make sure. So years ago, There was a study that was done by a really good scientific team, and what they did is they found that pigs recognize themselves in mirrors. And that study, in and of itself, was a very well done study. And if I, for instance, was going to use that to argue for pig welfare in a factory farm, I'd pull it and I'd wave it and I'd say, here it is. Well, it turns out that not long after that, another study was done, also very good, on a different strain of pigs. And they did not find the same findings. They did not find that they used the mirror in the same way. So what's the truth? Well, we don't know what the truth is. The truth is probably quite complex, quite complicated, but it's so important to know that this is not a settled issue, for instance, that we have a long way to go to fully understand what this means and for pigs, pig sentience, pig welfare, et cetera. So that's just an example. But there, for every there's so many examples like that, and nothing is really, really settled.
I think that's also a great example of the next item, cherry picking. Because if you, let's say you did do your comprehensive research, but you were like, this study's helpful, this one is not, I'm just going to use this one. That can be really problematic and that can come back to bite you. And that's not to say necessarily that when you're making your affirmative case, when you're in front of the legislature or in your opening brief, that you're going to talk at length about that other study, but you certainly need to be prepared for the fact that it's out there and how you're going to navigate it. And so it can be really tempting to just pick out the stuff that supports you and pretend like the rest of it doesn't exist. But that, if you're up against any opponent with resources and knowledge, it's not going to fly at the end of the day.
Unfortunately, a lot of times you get into this he said, she said kind of situation. Everybody thinks that they have the real truth, the real studies, that they're not the ones cherry picking. And so, there's a lot of that goes on in the peer review process in science and in advocacy, policy making, and litigation, where you're actually going to be battling with somebody who says, these are the real studies, this is the real truth, and you're trying to say something otherwise. And again, I think, there's absolutely nothing wrong with emphasizing the studies that you want to emphasize, but you need to know. And sometimes, the follow-up studies are not that good. And you need to know that too, that you have an answer for why you picked this study instead of that study. So that's another thing. It's,
Yeah. All
yeah.
right, next one. Let's say you did your comprehensive research, you didn't cherry pick, you've got this pile of studies to look at. You printed them out if you're old school like me. Um, don't just skim the studies. I know that can be so tempting, but not reading the whole thing can be problematic for a number of reasons. I mean, sometimes people just look at the abstract and they will cite something having read only the abstract. And that can be really problematic. Just to give an extreme example, I had a situation recently where someone cited an article and I went to look at it and the article is not in English. It had an abstract in English, but the article is not in English. And so I was like, how are you even relying on this study that you in a language that you don't speak? So you really need to look at the whole study, and especially important, you need to look at the methodology. For really basic things like how big was the sample size, but also for other considerations that I will let our scientists speak to.
Well, I think, yeah, it can be quite daunting. You have 30 papers in front of you. They're technical papers on some scientific issue. You're supposed to read it all and understand everything about it, even though there are all these terms and equations and et cetera, et cetera. And that's where, if you feel that you need the help, you should get a scientist collaborator. You really need to have somebody who knows this literature and can point out things to you that you might not see for good reason. So this is really where, you want to join with a scientist in that particular field to help you navigate and to help you find the things that are important, especially in the methodology section, because somebody who knows the literature can look at a methodology section and they'll be looking for some very specific things that you might not notice, and they can tell you about that. And that make a big difference, for how you articulate your argument. Also, I'd say you have to read the conclusion, even though there's a finding section, read the conclusion. And the reason is that that's where the authors, if they're honest, will say these are the limitations of the study. And they will give you their take on their interpretation of the study and insert their study in the argument, in the debate that's going on about that particular topic. So it is really good to read the conclusion, even though you have a finding section, because the conclusion kind of gives you the lay of the land. Okay, where does this fit in the whole landscape of this particular topic? So that's really important.
Yeah, and one of the things we cover in our class is just sort of basic 101 how to read a scientific study. And so that might be something that folks are interested in learning more about in a future event, perhaps. You can let us know. But for now, I'm going to move on to the next one, which is related though. So misrepresenting what a study says, and that can be done intentionally or it can be done unintentionally, and it's more likely to happen unintentionally if you have only skimmed the study. And so, you might misunderstand terminology that's used. You maybe are overstating things intentionally or unintentionally, but either way, that can ultimately harm you. I mean, your credibility is probably your most important asset as an advocate,
Mhm.
and that's an easy way to lose it really quickly. Not acknowledging and getting out ahead of weaknesses in a particular study that you're relying on. A big one is misusing statistics and relatedly visual representations of statistics. Lori, do you want to say a little bit more about that? That's another thing that we spend time on
Well,
in class.
statistics uh, summarize, describe, and analyze data for you. But the way you represent those statistical findings determines a lot about, the message you're sending. There was a book published a few years ago called How to Lie with Statistics. Okay. Very challenging title, right? And it caught everyone's attention. But you know what? It was very, very popular because what the author said in this book, which turned out to be true, is how you, not only what statistics you use, but how you display a graphic, for instance, the words you use, um, can lead people to think one thing versus another. Lying with graphs, for instance, graphs where, you'll see bars, bar graph, or pie chart, or something that summarizes data. Look very closely at that because depending upon what's on the axes, you can be saying one thing or another. And people know this and they use it. Where it's used a lot is in advertising, you know, where you'll see advertisements for a particular drug or a particular pain reliever or toothpaste. Um, you really look at what they're displaying there, and you may be surprised that it's not all kosher. Um, and that's just, that's because people are very visual, and advertisers know that when you look at something that really, you focus on that and they can make it look the way they want it to look to you. So be very careful about that.
All right, last pitfall, common pitfall we're going to talk about before we move on to best practices is superficial critiques. So now we're talking about how you're responding to science that the other side is relying on. And the biggest one that I've seen is, oh, this study was funded by this zoo industry group, or these authors work for SeaWorld. And that could be a compelling rhetorical point, and I'm not saying not to make it, but there's a real tendency, I've seen it over and over again, of folks to think you just need to point that out and then you can go home. But that is not the case because, merely the fact of the funder or of the authors does not mean that the studies are invalid.
Exactly. And so there really is, that's so important because that's part of the whole problem, the battle of in the peer reviewed literature. Unfortunately, there are, for instance, special issues where, if you look at who sponsors it, you kind of know what they're going to say. But that's a violation of what we hope is a more honest, professional way of conducting science communication, which is, you put it out there and you let your peers decide what's worthwhile, et cetera. So you really have to look at the study, and it is certainly not the case that every study that comes out of the zoo and aquarium industry is biased or a bad study. That's just not the case. Likewise, not every study that comes out of advocacy community is a bad study. You actually have to do the work of reading the study. And so that's really important to do an honest assessment of what's published.
All right, let's move on to best practices. And I think you'll see that some of these are just the other side of the coin of the pitfalls.
Yeah.
But even then, I think they're worth re-emphasizing.
And also
Um,
put questions in the Q&A so that we'll try to get to as many as we can.
yeah. So first best practice is integrating science from the outset. So you don't want this to be an afterthought in your advocacy. You really want to think about it from the very beginning when you're crafting your campaign or your legal theory, because it can inform which claims that you want to bring, which ones maybe aren't the strongest. It can inform how you want to frame a particular issue. So it really should be something you're thinking about from the very beginning all the way through to the very end.
I agree. And part of that is having access to scientists who would be willing to work with you, not like Elsie said, as an afterthought or just pulling them in at the last minute, but from the beginning and working with them as a partnership. That's really going to strengthen your case.
And then research thoroughly and continually. I think we already talked about this in the context of pitfalls. So the way to avoid those pitfalls is just make sure your research is as comprehensive as possible, and then you're not stopping. As long as your case or your campaign is going on, you're continuing to stay on top of the literature.
Yep.
And then similarly, go to the primary source.
Yeah.
We talked about that. I don't know if there's anything more you want to say about that, Lori.
I don't think so. And I think that sometimes people, if we say go to the primary source, what that means is you do have to read the primary source. But that doesn't mean you can't read summaries of that to get started, to get you started. There's nothing wrong with going to Wikipedia to get started on your journey. because they do involve sources. It's just that it can't be the end of it. It's only the beginning to get you kind of oriented and in that landscape. But then you go off from there and you make sure that for every important point, you have a peer-reviewed source. So it's not like gray literature is useless. It's really helpful to get you going, but it's the beginning. It's definitely not the be-all and end-all.
Yeah. So we're not saying secondary sources are useless. They're just a
Right.
good starting place. And they're a fantastic starting place, particularly if you're someone who's not trained in science and you're trying to
Exactly.
dive into scientific literature.
Exactly. Exactly.
Next one is read the whole study. I feel like we pretty clearly conveyed the reasons that it's important to do that. And then be accurate and honest. You don't want to be misrepresenting things because A, if your opponent, discovers that and points it out, you're going to be in a really bad position, certainly for that matter, but also it's going to undermine your credibility for
Mhm.
the long term.
Yeah.
Anticipating critiques. So, this too, exactly the same in law. You're not making your counter arguments in your opening brief, but you know what the strongest arguments that your opponent is going to make are exactly the same. You want to know for sure at the outset what studies your opponent is likely to rely on and how you are going to respond to those.
Yeah, no, and I think that's very important. And I think also when you're reading a paper, for instance, if the author or authors of that paper have the responsibility of placing their study in context, and they should be talking about papers that invalid, that don't necessarily confirm their hypothesis. So you need to sort of make sure that, the authors of the paper are open to giving you their findings in the context of other findings that may show something else. It's all about transparency, right?
Yeah. All right. Next one, I think, is maybe the most important one. Know when to enlist experts and how to enlist experts. So, we don't expect you to come away from this hour today fully capable of navigating the science on your own. We don't expect the students who've taken our class to be able to do that. I think one of the most important things you should come away from it with is a sense of when you're out of your depth and when you need to bring someone in with expertise. And that can be challenging. I think there's a lot of distrust within the scientific community of animal advocacy, of advocacy of any sort, probably, but certainly animal advocacy. I think a lot of, because of the animal industrial complex, a lot of scientists are very inextricably bound up with industry. And so there's a real reluctance to speak out on issues. Sometimes maybe they're relying on industry for sources. I mean, there's a scientist who did fantastic work about tuberculosis in elephants, for example, and some really damning stuff. But she was relying on access to Ringling Brothers' very infected herd, and she wasn't going to come out and say anything bad about them. So knowing how to navigate that is important. But there are scientists who are willing to talk with you, and there are different ways that you can collaborate with scientists. Maybe they're not going to speak out publicly. Maybe they're not going to go on the stand for you, but maybe they'll talk to you privately and help you understand the literature and make sense of it.
And I think that, having been in academia for such a long time, I can tell you that, a lot of scientists in academia, they get funding for doing certain kind of research, and they may not be tenured yet, or, there's all kinds of contingencies. But I think the thing I can say is that the way you situate yourself is really going to determine whether or not you get to talk to scientists. So you can be in a department in academia, you can be in a law department, and you need to go to the chemistry department or biology department for some expert advice, and how you approach that person can often determine whether they respond to you. Don't make an enemy of your colleagues because they are your colleagues. You may not like everything they're doing, but they are your colleagues. And so it's really important to find a way to communicate and in a non-threatening way and say, look, hey, you know, this is what I'm trying to accomplish. So you'd be surprised that, how many scientists will work with you if you approach them the right way. Of course, there are many who will not. So this is a difficult thing. One of the things that Delcy and I and Kathy and I have been talking about is developing a database of scientists who are available and open to working with lawyers and legal scholars and advocates. And we're going to be working on that very soon, and that hopefully will be helpful to those of you in the advocacy legal area, so that you know who to go to. But yeah, I mean, it's a tough one. I mean, as a scientist who is in academia, I could be sitting having lunch with somebody who does vivisection. Um, and how you choose to relate to that issue can determine whether or not you can ever talk to that person again or not. So keep your eye on the prize and make sure that you always are respectful to your colleagues, because then you have a greater chance of them being respectful towards you.
And I did notice some of you in the webinar are scientists, so I hope that you might reach out and let us know about the database. And I see Kathy's here, so I think that means she wants us to stop talking so we can take your questions. So I'll just very quickly say, we are happy to chat with you about any of this, really, but certainly about navigating communicating with scientists. And it's important to recognize that they're potentially putting themselves on the line and to recognize the position that they're in. And related to that, to clearly communicate with them what they can expect. If they're signing up to be a full-on expert in a case, you need to tell them at the outset that it's possible they'll be deposed, for example. But now we'll open it up for questions. And also here's our contact info if you have questions we don't get to.
Nope.
Thank you so much. This has been really helpful. And we do have a number of questions. And they're sort of grouped around the same kind of concept, which is like how, right? How to reach out, how to find documents that are behind paywalls, and whether sort of the distinctions maybe even between academic scientists and scientists who work in other venues. So parsing those, and starting simply. So when legal folks in the legal space are trying to find studies, right, to do the work that you suggest they do, they may hit paywalls and they don't even necessarily know that there are, services, right, that collate these studies. So what are your suggestions about finding those kinds of documents and studies?
I'll start because I happen to be at one of the very few independent law schools, which means we're not affiliated with a large university, which means we don't have access to those databases either, which means we're teaching our students how to do this research without that access. So the first thing I'll say is that there are some databases that are free and accessible that are very useful. I'm not going to say they're totally comprehensive, but I mean, Google Scholar, just to give one example, is a really fantastic resource. And it is going to point you towards some studies that are behind paywalls. And then depending on your setting, you might need to do an interlibrary loan request. That's what I do, but sometimes I get them in like an hour, or find a friend who's in an academic institution with better access. Lori, do you want to add to that?
Yeah, no, I mean, if you can't get a study online, I mean, just email the author and ask for it. And that's a good way to get to the author to know you in case, you will need to reintroduce yourself to that person later on. Um, don't don't feel like people in science are unapproachable and all of that stuff. That's baloney. Just email them and say, hey, can you send me a PDF? And, more times than not, they will.
And
And
it's pretty remarkable how you can find experts just by Googling, because academics are easy to track down. We all have a bio page. It has our email on it, whether we want it or not. But I mean, we're also in the business of teaching people. So when someone's interested in our little niche research topic, we're over the moon and we're happy to talk with you about it. So just reach out. Don't be intimidated. I think you'll be surprised by the responses you'll get.
right.
And following up on that exact point, someone's asking, what is sort of maybe the best way to do that outreach, knowing that you're asking someone to spend some of their free time maybe talking about like their analysis, right, a little bit more deeply, or their interpretations. And so what is sort of the respectful way to communicate with them to get what you need, understanding that they're super busy and maybe other people are trying to, use their time in other ways as well.
Well, I would say, because I get a lot of requests from students and attorneys and advocates. Be very prepared and specific about what you're asking for. You know, if you're interested in potentially seeing if this person might be a good expert witness for you, or if you have some really specific concerns or questions about a topic, you need to be specific, because to say to somebody, well, I really like your research and I'm really interested. Can you tell me all about it? Being on the receiving end of that, you just want to jump off the roof. I mean, there's nothing you can do with that. What you can do as a scientist, if you're nice, is go back and say, can you tell me a little bit more? Or be a little bit more specific so I can help you. So be respectful by doing your homework and asking very specific questions to orient the person. Because they don't have they don't have a lot of time. So the more specific you are, the better it is for them and the easier it is for them to help you.
And I mean, that absolutely agree with all of that. I'll also just add that folks have a soft spot for students, whether they're a scientist or a judge, not everybody, but oftentimes. And so if you are a student, I would feel even more emboldened. Still do your research, respect their time for sure. Or if you have a student helping you out, maybe you have a student intern, maybe they're going to reach out in their capacity as a student, at least in the first instance.
Right. That's a really good point. Yeah.
That's great. Thank you. So we have another question about the nuances of approaching industry-allied scientists and researchers,
Yeah.
and whether you have any examples of success stories or some strategies for approaching them. And I'm sure it matters what you're approaching them for, but just sort of generally.
Yeah.
I actually think this is an area where academic intermediaries can be really helpful, and law school clinics in particular. So I think one of the really amazing things about law school clinics is they can bring together coalitions of groups that maybe wouldn't work together otherwise, but also experts who you want to enlist to support those coalitions are, I know from experience, much more willing to speak to someone who is an academic, who is a professor, even if they're representing these groups. And I mean, I worked with a veterinarian from UC Davis on a matter, and when I was at Lewis and Clark running the animal law litigation clinic, totally fine. And then Peter reached out to her for some help with something, and she was not interested in speaking with them at all. So I think that can help. Of course, not everyone has that opportunity, although there are some great law school clinics that would be happy to work with you, including at GW and Vermont Law. I think otherwise, just acknowledging you're not going to agree on everything, and that's okay.
Yeah. I agree with everything you said. And the fact of the matter is that some people will speak with you and others, especially in certain industries, will not. Or they'll work against you. So, you can only control how you approach somebody and hope that they're going to be receptive.
And I'm guessing it's sort of similar to what Delcy was saying before, sometimes more receptive to students. They might be, some people might be more receptive to the scientists you're collaborating with, and some might be less receptive if they're already seen as sort of oppositional. But yeah, so trying to figure out who in your network might be the right person to do that outreach.
And I think what Delcy said also is find the common ground. So you might ask somebody for help with something that, you might think, oh, this person will never help because they're in this industry, et cetera. But if you have a common ground, sometimes people will just put aside those differences and work together for that common goal. It's a laudable thing to do, and you hope people do that. Not everybody's able to, but that is something, if you find a common ground, put that in that context, that gives you a better chance of getting that person to agree to help you.
I just want to add a few things on that. I think related to that, just like be respectful. They're still human beings. Maybe they do things that we don't like. As animal advocates, most people do things we don't like, but they're still human beings. Also, if you do enlist a scientist to help you, maybe they can then do outreach to other scientists. And then lastly, I just wanted to note some of the best experts I've had are folks who are retired because they don't have this, they don't face the same risks, the same career risks for speaking out on an issue. And some of them, I've encountered this more than once, feel guilty about the things that they feel like they were complicit in and want to make up for it.
Exactly. I mean, you could give them a chance for redemption in a way, and it could be for anything, but yeah, I think that's right. That a lot of people, once they hit a certain point in their career, especially if they're retired, and have a chance to really think through everything, they may be looking for a way to give back. And that's a wonderful thing to do.
And I think so powerful, right? So someone who had reached opposite conclusions and has now a more nuanced perspective, yeah, I think has a lot of credibility in a way that's really unique to people in those situations.
Mhm.
Yeah. So
Yeah.
maybe one last thing, because we're running up on time. And this is, do you have any quick thoughts about, so if everyone does everything that you guys have suggested, we're now presenting information to judges or legislators or policymakers who may run the risks of the same, like misunderstanding or not understanding science. So any quick thoughts about that? I know it's not the topic, and so sorry to spring this on you, but if you have any thoughts.
Delcy?
Yeah, well, I'll say we do have a section of our course on communicating science, public communication of science, including in law and policy context. And you can take our course. It is asynchronous online. And we're actually, I haven't even told Kathy and Lori this, but we're launching an animal protection policy credential. So that's a lot more affordable than a degree. So that's available to you all. But for now, I'll say it's a lot of the same things that we've talked about. It's, being careful not to misrepresent things. But then also you need to just really try to distill things down. I think analogies can be really helpful, but also risky because you don't want to misrepresent anything. I think that's the biggest thing to be careful about is trying to translate and be accessible, which an expert can be really the pairing of a lawyer and a scientist there, I think is more important than anywhere else. But then still being careful.
That's great. Yeah, and I wanted to just give you that opportunity since you do teaching in communication generally and in this space. I've put in the chat a link to the Vermont curriculum so that folks can go straight to those courses if you're interested.
That's
So we are at the top of our time. So I want to thank Delcy and Lori so very much for this conversation and to let the audience know, one, that the recording will be posted, but two, we're looking into the next stage of this communication. And so stay tuned for that kind of information. And thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank
everybody,
you so
and
much,
please do reach out.
everyone. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.